was over. I was working in a record store, and I get a strange phone call one morning. It says, Paul Kamenetsky. I said, yes. We would like to know if you'd like to help your people be on the corner of 39th Street and Lexington Avenue Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And a man with a black leather jacket will walk by. If he puts a newspaper under his arm, follow him. If he puts it in a wastepaper basket there, walk away because you're being followed. Click.
One day in synagogue, some guy who was a great Zionist tells me they're looking for people with training, merchant marine training, seagoing people, to help do something in Europe to get the Jews out of the DP camps, displaced persons camps. So I said, okay, I'll look into it. And I went to meet the people who were so-called recruiting.
So it begins, innocently, naively. Not knowing what they're getting into, soon Paul and Murray will be involved in one of the strangest underground wars of the century. This war will also involve 200 other young Americans. It is a war which will be fought across the rocky shores of the Mediterranean, in prison camps, will create battles with FBI, and will change Paul and Murray forever. Summer 1945. After 5.5 years, the war is over. The guns are silent. The boys are coming back, and America rejoices. But over in Europe, the scene is different. There, millions search for home amid the rubble and destruction of the war. Among them are 150,000 Jews who live with memories of murder and the death camps. For them, the concepts of home and refuge have ceased to exist. They see only one hope, a new life in Palestine. Yet between dream and reality lie the British, who have slammed shut the gates of Palestine to Jewish immigration. In a vibrant New York, these events seem very distant. But slowly, the shadows from Europe are beginning to affect the lives of a number of Americans. Born in Manhattan, Paul enlisted in the Navy at age 17 during the war. After demob, he was working in a music store when he got his Save Your People phone call.
And I went down to Lexington Avenue on Thursday at 4 o'clock on 39th Street. And sure enough, at 4 o'clock, a man walks by with a black leather jacket, tucks a newspaper under his arm. I follow him around the corner. He goes up to a building. He says, well, you want to help us? We're going to run small boats between Cyprus and Palestine. He said, if the British catch you, they're going to hang you. I said, let's go.
Murray, another New Yorker, had joined the Merchant Marine in 1944. In 1947, Murray was waiting to get into college, but then came the mention of the ships and the call for volunteers.
When I went to see the recruiting people, and he explained to me the whole story, and finally I said to him, listen, what do you get paid for this deal? And he says, there's no money. So I said, I'm going. That to me was the big challenge. There's no money, then I thought it was important.
One of the recruiting personnel for the operation was a young New York social worker, Ralph Goldman.
It got around from sailor to sailor. Basically, that's how people came. Many non-Jews as well, and some Jews. It was difficult to find out whether, from a security point of view, from our point of view, we could trust them.
In New York, plans were made by Jewish underground, the Haganah, to secretly purchase 10 ships to challenge the British embargo policy. The money, a lot of money, had to be raised for the ships.
And Jews were coming from all over the country, bringing their jewels and their money every Thursday. And it was that money that was used to buy the ships in America. I was sent to the Panama consulate. They gave me $50,000 in cash to give it to them, and I got the flag. I was just an errand boy.
Meanwhile, the hunt for volunteers now covered the whole of the eastern seaboard, particularly Boston. Here were marine halls, union centers, and the country's top universities who included many ex-Navy men, such as Harold Katz, among their students.
During World War II, I served aboard a U.S. destroyer with the Pacific Fleet. It was a fighting ship. We were fought in the Pacific. I was in the Navy for 3.5 years. I earned 9 battle stars.
In 1947, Harold was a first-year student at Harvard Law School, along with an Irish non-Jewish friend, Hugh MacDonald. Influenced by the horrors of the Holocaust, both decided to volunteer for the ships.
We waited for instructions, and we simply didn't go back to the law school. MacDonald and I just disappeared. They didn't know until more than a year later what had happened to us. We just were in class one day, and then we were gone.
We had a number of non-Jewish boys. One was an Irishman with great anti-British feeling, and he had this, he's going to get even with them. We had a Polish fella who spoke better Yiddish than anybody else.
As a young man also, I worked in a lot of Yiddish bakeries. I was a pretty good bagel maker. And I was practically raised in Strawberry Mansion, an all Yiddish neighborhood. And I had a very good friend of mine, Mikey Perlstein. And one day when I came in off the ships, he says to me, "Hey, Duke," he said, "we need some seamen, because we're going to try to get the displaced people out of Europe and bring them to Israel so they can have a homeland."
After recruitment, a number of the volunteers were told to meet at LaGuardia Airport in preparation for a flight. The destination was Miami, Florida, a sleepy town which featured a lot of Art Deco architecture, a small harbor, and the volunteer ship.
We congregated on the wharf side at a dock, and we had a first glimpse at that moment of the ship which we were expected to take across the Atlantic, and it was a rust bucket, as they say. It didn't look like it would cross a river, much less cross the ocean.
So we got a hold of him. He said, listen, you know, do you know what a definition of a ship is? And he looks at us and says, "That's a ship." He says, no. There's a definition for a ship. It goes like this. A boat is something you can put on a ship. There's a big boat, but it ain't no ship.
The Trade Winds, a former icebreaker, had been built in 1898. In the Second World War, she served as a Coast Guard cutter, searching for enemy submarines in the Atlantic. Rusty, dilapidated, and ready for the graveyard, it looked barely capable of holding 100 passengers. Yet plans called for it to carry over 1,500 people to Palestine. Days were now spent on cleaning, rebuilding, and repairs. Then came the order: sail for Baltimore to take on the rest of the crew. Charlie Weiss, age 17, had abandoned university and arrived at Baltimore by train.
They just gave me the dock number and told me to get there with a taxi or something. The ship itself, to my untutored eye, was enormous. It really wasn't. It was, I think, 205 feet long and 650 tons or something like that.
The ship was a Panamanian registered ship, and with a Panamanian flag, and I had Panamanian Seaman papers, so we could sail legally. I believe that the captain had to be a bona fide, and he was, Captain Scown, a real captain, a bona fide captain, takes his ship out.
With the realities of the future still misty, the trade winds left Baltimore, bound for Portugal in February 1947.
As we set sail, we hit the tail end of a hurricane. And I want to tell you, I've seen seas in my day, but this was unbelievable. The ocean, I've never seen anything like it. And at one point, our ship was almost turned over.
I think it began to dawn on Scanlon that he didn't have exactly a professional crew. Very few of us had real professional experience. We had guys who came off the streets, were escaping their wives or didn't want the responsibility of working in their father's businesses, or simply thought it easier to drift than to do something.
Altogether, there were 27 volunteers on the ship, their backgrounds and motivations extremely mixed.
These kids, we had a couple of kids who had never been on a ship before in their lives, and we had to train them to work on the ship as able personnel. The crew, there was no distinction as you would have on a normal ship where the officer gives a command, everybody does it. On this ship, you gave a command and they say, what for, why, you know?
All the crew knew they would pick up immigrants and probably confront the British. But what did this mean? Everything was hazy, unclear, unfocused. The answer was that they would be up against the Palestine Patrol, a special British naval task force operating out of its base in Malta.
Before we went on the Palestine Patrol, we were sent to a camp in Malta where we were given supposedly toughening up training, carried out by a Royal Marine.
John GOODLIFFE was drafted into the Royal Navy while doing his 2-year national service. In 1947, he was an able seaman aboard HMS Cheviot, part of the Palestine Patrol.
We had no battle experience fighting with wooden clubs, so we were just pitched into it and hoped for the best, I suppose.
There were Royal Marine gunnery courses in Malta, which included courses on boarding and how to board with a minimum of force.
Lieutenant Alan Tyler had joined the Royal Navy in 1938. In 1947, he was serving aboard the HMS Chevron, taking part of the Palestine Patrol.
Palestine Patrol involved patrolling from the Lebanese border at Rosh HaNikra down to just south of Tel Aviv. The destroyers all had radar, so of course they could pick up any ships approaching, and they could question them, check whether they were ordinary merchant ships on a routine trip or whether they were likely immigrants or smugglers.
In 1947, Admiral Teddy Goeritz was a senior naval officer serving with the Mediterranean Fleet.
One of the tasks that the destroyer I was in had to perform was the Palestine Patrol. This was a duty that rotated between destroyers and frigates and sloops serving in the Mediterranean Fleet, and the purpose was to control immigration into Palestine.
Further exclusive Storm Centre reports from Palestine, where men of the British Army and the Palestine Police watched the arrival of a shipload of illegal Jewish immigrants at Haifa. Crowded decks and a packed hold as the newcomers look joyfully towards the land they claim as a national home.
The British policy regarding the Holocaust survivors was controversial, and the British tried to put the best gloss possible on their actions.
In a number of cases, the ships they were being sent in were grossly overcrowded and not seaworthy, and our concern was that was their safety as much as anything else.
Two former American vessels carrying nearly 4,000 Jewish refugees arrive at the port of Haifa, Palestine. The death of an infant was first blamed on British tear gas, but examination showed it was accidentally crushed and suffocated on the overcrowded ship.
Goeritz was right. Most of the ships heading for Palestine were overloaded. But Britain's real concern was Arab anger.
The British were out trying to stop these vessels from running. They had their MI5 throughout the ports in Europe, and they were finding and chasing ships, and they knew what they were doing.
While the trade winds was crossing the Atlantic heading for Portugal, the British High Command tried different ways to stop the ships. All British oil companies with bunkers in the Mediterranean were instructed to deny fuel to suspect vessels. At that time, in mid-Atlantic, the trade winds ran low on fuel.
We're in the Azores, and in the Azores, we had to get fuel. And in the Azores, they have the fuel people, not wanting to give us fuel. And we're walking on the dock, on the pier, and I'm with the chief and the first, and I say to them, "Oy vey, look at this, we can't get," and with that, a little gentleman walks over to me and says, "Oy vey, I mean, did you say oy vey?" I says, "Yes." He says to me, "What's tis to do? What are you doing here?" I said, "In Staffel and Seaman." He says to me, Seaman is oil in Yiddish. He says to me, he says, "Come with me." The little guy out of nowhere took us into an office, signed papers for us, loaded the ship with fuel. We signed papers from the company who brought the ship there, and we got fuel to continue.
Eventually, the trade winds arrived at Lisbon. Here, major work had to be done on the ship to get it to hold 1,600 displaced persons.
In Portugal, there we met a Palestinian, an Israeli. We met a Palestinian from a kibbutz. He was our contact. We met him, and he was the man who really laid down all the rules, what was going to happen, how we're going to rebuild this vessel, what we should say we're doing there, and why we're doing it.
The Haganah agent was called Joshua. His cover story was that he was Captain Diamond, nicknamed Brilliant, working for the United Fruit Company. His greatest concern was secrecy.
And Brilliant came on board, and he said, "Fellas, when you go ashore, don't speak about anything except that we were outfitting the ship for take from bananas for the U.S. Fruit Company or whatever it was, and that's the mission of this ship, to go get bananas."
He passed himself off there as the representative of a shipping company, and he was going to prepare this ship to carry bananas to South America. He employed carpenters, and he ordered materials, and the whole hold of the ship was gutted in Lisbon. And the workmen, not knowing what they were building this for, built into the hold layers of shelves with narrow aisles, and when the people came aboard finally, they crawled into those shelves, and they lay there, as I always say, like loaves of bread on a baker's shelf.
We tie up in Lisbon next to a British tugboat, and in order to go ashore, you walk over the tugboat. As we're going, the seamen say to us, "Hey, Yanks, we hear there's a Jew ship in port. Would you help us look for it?" We said we certainly would.
We didn't walk around looking over our shoulders, and we didn't look for the guys in the slouch hats and the trench coats with the collars turned up. We're young fellows, and maybe we didn't understand the situation fully, but we were sort of carefree and happy-go-lucky in a sense.
In the afternoon and evenings, there was time to knock off. Most of the volunteers, like Harold, were in their 20s and in Europe for the first time.
We would enjoy sitting in these cafeterias on the main street. it was quite an elegant street at that time, and we would drink hot chocolate. We weren't drinkers. We didn't drink beer or whiskey, or we didn't get drunk the way sailors do. We did go to a bar on Avenida de Libertad where we met girls, and we paired off, and we had girlfriends. We'd met them almost every day after we'd get off the ship.
In spite of all the secrecy, the Lisbon police and the British got wind of the ship.
One night, Captain Brillant came on board and said, "Fellas, we gotta go. They've caught wise. They ransacked my hotel room, and they're looking for papers. Get out." So we tried, we couldn't bring the anchor up. And we were dragging it to get out a little bit. And I was on deck, I look around, I see the city of Lisbon getting dark. What had happened, we were dragging the anchor in the port and pulling up the electric wires, and we're knocking out the electricity. So I could see that it's getting dark all around, and we're getting out. It was quite an adventure to get out of Lisbon.
From Lisbon, the trade winds passed through the Straits of Gibraltar. Tension was rising. In a few days, they would head for a clandestine coastal rendezvous and finally take aboard the DPs. But where were the DPs? In Germany and Austria, heading for the coasts of France and Italy, the gateways to a promised land.
אחרי שהיינו יחד באזור הצרפתי בגרמניה, בא יום אחד משאיות צבאיות, ונכנסנו למכוניות, סגרו אותנו בברזנטים, והעבירו אותנו דרך כל אוסטריה עד לגבול האיטלקי.
Crossing the border had to be made in secret. The DPs often being smuggled in ex-US Army trucks manned by Haganah men in official-looking uniforms. Everywhere, bribes had to be paid. The rate was a carton of cigarettes, worth $150 for each DP allowed through.
הגענו למרגלות האלפים באוסטריה לפנות ערב, וזה היה בנובמבר, כשזה כבר באלפים חורף עמוק. כל הלילה הובילו אותנו דרך השלג ודרך ההר.
היה צריך לעלות בשלג. השלג הגיע עד הברכיים, הוא לא היה מוצק אלא רך, ושקענו בתוך השלג, היה מאוד קשה ללכת. אני זוכרת שהייתה שם בחורה אחת שממש התקשתה ללכת, והיינו צריכים ממש לסחוב אותה, והיו גם אנשים מבוגרים עם ילדים, אבל זה היה מאוד קשה. וככה הלכנו כל הלילה בשלג ובעלייה.
After crossing the Alps, the DPs moved south through Italy to rendezvous with the volunteer ship. Meanwhile, after a brief stay in Marseille, the trade winds set sail for Porto Venere to pick up the refugees.
היה מאורגן שמרחוק ראו מגן דוד על החוף, זה היה מין קוד כזה של אורות, הדליקו שהאונייה תוכל להתקרב.
We pull into a port in Italy, and there the light is flashing, and we come in close to the seawall. We stop, drop our anchor there, we stay there.
And slowly, just on the shore, on the hill along the side shore, headlights start to come into view. And the headlights are coming in bigger and bigger, more and more and more. And we realize that these are trucks. And from these trucks, they unload these survivors of the Holocaust. And it's all night long.
We put lifeboats over the side and with long hawsers, which is a rope, and they pulled these boats back and forth with people from the shore, and this is the first time I met my people. What I saw was my mother, my aunt, my uncle, my people who had gone through difficult time, and each one of them, as they climbed up the ladder and came over the side, these were the first time I saw DPs, displaced persons. Each one hugged you as they came over, and they said to us, "Ins Gemet to Eretz Yisrael." We're going to Israel, to our promised land.
They unload, they get into the rubber boat, pull themselves out to our vessel, climb up the ladder, go down below decks. I'm not allowed to talk to them because they'll be afraid, if they hear English, they'll be afraid that they're caught by the British.
אנחנו היינו מעבר לכל פחד. אחרי כל החוויות שאנחנו עברנו במשך 5 שנים של המלחמה, וכל מה שהיה מאחורינו, לא היה לי, אני מדבר על עצמי, לא היה לי שום פחד, רק רצון להגיע.
We tell all the people, it's 1,500 to go below decks. You can just imagine how crowded it was. The people are sleeping on bunk beds, so-called. Every row is 20 inches. Every line is 20 inches. And we've got people stuck in there. To get 1,500 people on this small vessel is not exactly easy. I know Yiddish. So I spoke with these people. And of course, it was a devastating experience. And with each one, it's a different Holocaust. Every story you hear is different. Wherever they came from, the camps that they were at. It had a profound effect on me. I felt very close to them.
הם היו סקרנים, הם רצו לשמוע ממני. אני רציתי לשמוע מהם. והיה קומוניקציה טובה מאוד, עמד שם באנג'ין רום איזה בקבוק ענק של פורט שהם הביאו מפורטוגל, של יין, ועל זה היה באמת, על כוס יין, תמיד נוצר משהו טוב.
I was really lucky that I happened to have been born in the United States and brought up in the United States, because my parents could have just as well met in Europe and gotten married there, and I could have been climbing the ladder that night.
להכיר אנשים שנלחמו נגד הנאצים, והם יהודים, ואחרי המלחמה באים עוד בהתנדבות לקחת אותנו מאירופה לארץ ישראל, בשבילי זה היה דבר יוצא מהכלל. זה החזיר לנו, לי, במידה רבה, אמונה בבני אדם.
היא מצאה חן בעיניי חדווה, אבל היא לא כך הסכימה. אז שבא הרגע הרומנטי, עם הים הכחול, עם הירח.
ואז התנשקנו פעם ראשונה.
As the trade winds sailed further and further east, overshadowing everything was the thought that somewhere out there waiting for them were the ships of the Palestine Patrol.
The Air Force was flying patrols well out into the Mediterranean, and they sent reports back to the Commodore in Haifa, who would brief us if there were any ships notified as coming our way.
A couple of days off the coast of Palestine, an airplane flies overhead. And we feel something, so we tell all the people, it's 1,500 to go below decks. Everything could be closed up, down below decks. Nobody could be on top deck anymore. That's it.
And the airplane comes down on us, reconnoiters us, goes up, comes around, makes a circle, comes back again, and we knew we were spotted.
We were on patrol when we had a report from a patrolling aircraft that a ship some 150 miles away from Haifa was suspect.
The airplane comes. Next morning, destroyer escorts. Beautiful vessels. And we don't know what to do. Tell the people sweat down below decks. We're caught. What the hell's the difference? So we tell them, open the hatches, come on up on deck. Well, they come on deck, and they run to one side, and they run to the other, and the ship starts to rock back and forth because they're looking at these beautiful big destroyer escorts.
We were warned that there was a ship coming in, and we and another destroyer went out to intercept it. We caught it up well at sea, and we just shadowed it.
We feel, the sailors, that, well, we're caught. No. These survivors tell us, no, we're going to fight, even if we're caught.
And we began how we were going to defend the ship against the British. And we developed an elaborate plan to steer the ship from the engine room in the event that the British captured the bridge.
We gave the refugees cans of food that we had been using for food and that we no longer would be using because the British would take us as missiles to throw. And we organized at various places on the deck and up in the bridge to resist.
And they pull up alongside close to us, and they make an announcement. You are an illegal ship. You have no right to be here.
And they told us on the loudspeaker, Paul said, we know that you are an illegal immigrant ship. Let me talk to your captain. We took a young fellow, maybe 10 years old, 12 years old, and we gave him a megaphone and put a cap on his head, put him on the bridge, and he said, I'm the captain, the kid. Well, they knew we were joking. They knew that we were not cooperating.
And we renamed the ship now the Hatikva. And we put up a Jewish flag in those days. Today's an Israeli flag. And we call it the Hatikva, and we're sailing along, and these destroyers are making circles around us.
They hoisted the future Israeli flag. They changed their name, and all the immigrants came up on deck shouting that they wanted to go to Haifa. Normally 2 destroyers would board a ship, 1 on each side, so that you could, the idea was to get to the bridge and the engine room so that you could control where they were steering and keep the engines running.
All of a sudden, 2 destroyers come up alongside of you, and they hit you from both sides at once like a nutcracker. They come up alongside and they hit you, and they throw ropes on you and little gangways, and Marines, armed Marines, come running on board.
We had to board the ship by going alongside and jumping. I was on the forecastle of my ship, and all I had to do was step straight onto the wing of the bridge.
The British Marines jumped aboard. The British had their helmets and their big shields and clubs. Oh, I would say clubs were 1 meter long with lead at the end. And there was a considerable amount of hand-to-hand fighting, and some people were hurt.
These survivors fought like tigers, and they kept them off rolling. In fact, they threw a bunch of guys over the side also.
I was smacked across the face with a club that was angled from a different direction, so I wasn't expecting it. We managed to take over the wheelhouse simply by advancing into it, looking very threatening in a white steel helmet, and eventually we were left in charge.
I planned to escape, and I went over the fantail into the water. I dove in, and I remember swimming underwater for perhaps a minute to get away from the ship, and I seemed to notice searchlights on the surface of the water. There I could see them sweeping, and it was my intention to swim ashore, as I said.
Unfortunately, Harold was picked up by a British boat and held under pistol threat.
The ship was under tow and by a third ship on our party, and we went into Haifa docks and unloaded all the people on board.
Once ashore, the volunteers like Harold tried hard to conceal the fact that they were Americans.
And this British officer approached, and he says to me, "Do you speak English?" Silly trick, of course, and nothing, didn't respond. And then he says to the soldiers, "Don't beat him with the sticks." That didn't evoke any response.
You could understand they were eager to get away from the Nazis and all the problems that they'd had during the Holocaust. So we were piggy in the middle. We felt sorry for them, but we had to do our duty and stop the ship and eventually take the people to Cyprus.
The volunteers and the DPs were now hurried aboard a British prison ship, the Empire Castle, for transport to the port of Famagusta. Nothing had prepared the volunteers for the shock of the Cyprus camp, where thousands of DPs had been interned by the British since 1946.
Wake up in the morning, slept on the ground behind barbed wire, double rows of barbed wire, and British soldiers outside. That was probably the biggest shock in my life.
We had none of the amenities of life. We had trickle of water. Maybe you had as much as a glass of water a day. I would wash my face, brush my teeth, even shaved, all with one glass of water.
When you peel potatoes, they would throw them away. We'd go in the garbage and pick out the peels and boil them in hot water. We took the potato peels, we made potato soup. Food was very scarce.
For the volunteers, this was all part of a mad, surreal experience, a period of waiting and learning about life. Just another element of the crazy adventure whose end no one could foresee. For the DPs, it was a different experience. They had seen too many camps, too many prisons to accept their fate with passive acceptance. Demonstrations became the norm, with plans being made for resistance and breakout.
But there was always plans to escape. One of the crazy escape plans is that they had a group of us digging a tunnel under this double rows of barbed wire out into the sea. And I was involved in digging this thing day and night.
We took one of the tents right on the perimeter, next to the barbed wire around which the British patrolled. And we brought in shovels, and then we started to dig.
You don't realize it. When you dig, sand comes up. Suddenly the floor got very high. We didn't know what to do. So at night, we started taking the sand, put it into gunny sacks, into sacks, and we carry it and put it into the toilets, because there were outhouses all over the place. Outhouses started to get filled up. It was crazy. It was crazy.
Meanwhile, the struggle between the Haganah and the British became even more intense when 3 destroyers attacked an immigrant ship way out at sea.
Largest illegal immigrant ship to date, the American vessel President Warfield, renamed Exodus 1947, arrives in Haifa with nearly 5,000 on board. Tear gas, smoke bombs and other weapons were used against the British boarding party before the ship's captain agreed to be escorted into harbour.
The British government now embarked on a drastic change of policy. Instead of taking the Exodus refugees to Cyprus, they were sent back to Germany, an act that inflamed world public opinion.
The Exodus was caught while we were in Cyprus. the Haganah decided that they had to retaliate. And so they started to bring gelignite into the camps.
Harold and Murray were now told to abandon their half-finished escape tunnel and prepare themselves for sailing to Palestine in one of the permitted quota groups. Their task, alongside other volunteers, was to smuggle explosives aboard the British transport ship.
We came to the port of Famagusta, and they searched us. Body search, I never forget. Sonny Weintraub, who was the radio operator for my ship, he had to tape the detonator in his behind. We had to go through a body search to get to the prison ship. I never forget. There was an Australian general walking by, and he said to his underling, "I hear they're going to try to blow this ship up. If they're successful, they're going to transfer me back to Australia." And I said to myself, man, you're going back.
In their efforts to smuggle explosives onto the ship, the Haganah had packed gelignite inside a small bag carried by a 9-year-old girl called Bootsy. Ironically, it was a British woman sergeant who helped Bootsy get through the inspection.
The British sergeant comes up and says, "Bootsy, you're going to your homeland. Let me take your bag." She picks it up and starts to walk to the ship. And the British guard says, "Let me inspect that bag." And the sergeant says, "What are you talking? This is my friend Bootsy. She's going to her homeland." And she carries the bag full right onto the ship for us and drops it down and gives Bootsy a hug and walks down.
The British prison ship carrying the volunteers had been used for months to carry refugees to Cyprus. Now it was heading for Haifa, while a bomb was being built in its hold.
With us is one Palestinian. We knew how to set the explosive off. And this guy, Moshe, says, okay. He tells one of the other guys, he says, "You come down with me now. I'm going to set it. And if a Britisher comes, here's a knife, you kill him." This American looks at him, but they go down below. And they set the detonator.
The detonator is set a half-mile out at sea, and we hear the anchor going down, and that would mean that the way the timer is set, the ship would go down, we'd all be out at sea.
The Empire rival anchored 400 yards offshore, but the detonator had been fused and the bomb could blow any second.
We look around. What's going to happen now? Moshe, how much time do we have? He says, "This detonator is set for 3 hours, because we thought we were going to go right in, you'll all get off the ship, and you'll be away from the dock. It'll blow up." Well, we're sitting on top of it all. And 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a half hour, 3/4.
I say, "Moshe, you got to stop the detonator." Moshe says, "When I went to school, they taught me how to set it. They didn't teach me how to stop it. I don't know how."
Thank God we were there maybe, I don't know, it seemed like 20 years, but maybe 20 minutes, half hour. They start taking up the anchor and they start to go into the port.
They start sailing, they put up anchor and they start sailing right into the dock. And we give orders to everybody, quietly and nicely, and it spreads all over the ship. Quickly, no difficulties. Walk off nicely. Let's not make any difficulty. And we got the people that are walking off, and we're the last ones over there. And as we walk off, we hear
boom, and the ship shook, and there's a guy up on the thing hollering, "Fire in the hold," which is a thing, and the ship blew a hole in it, and she sank right on the pier.
And so the ship was sunk right by the dock. It was sunk by the crew of the Hatikva.
But blowing up a British ship was no laughing matter. The American volunteers now faced serious prison sentences if caught.
We were transferred off the prison ships onto buses, and the buses took us to Atlit in Palestine. And we're back in again into another detention camp.
The British started searching in Atlit, trying to find the guys who blew it up. It was pandemonium. You didn't know what to do. And we just kept going, changing, getting into different lines. Because if they would question us, they'd catch our accent right away.
Atlit Camp, which lay 15 kilometers south of Haifa, had been built by the British in 1938 as a military barracks. A year later, it was turned into a holding center for illegal immigrants. As in Cyprus, the idea of escape was very high on the agenda.
I never forget that night going under the fence. We had to listen to someone whistling in the dark, Hatikva. And we heard them whistling. We went to where the sound was coming from, and they put us into a cab, like we laid down flat, and they drove us into Haifa. Some of the guys from my ship out of Cyprus were put in fish barrels. They came out later on, about a week later. And when they came into the hotel room, they stunk. We threw them out of the room.
I remained in Israel until this was towards the end of the summer, when I returned to the States.
By the new year, many of the volunteers were back in America. They had fled the British and expected to be welcomed home as heroes. Never had they imagined that American security forces would come after them. But the poison of suspicion was everywhere.
I came home and a neighbor said to me, "Hey, Paul, the cops are looking for you." I said, "What?" "Yeah, there's a bunch of cops in the building looking for Paul Kamenetsky."
One day I get a telephone call, and I didn't know how they caught me. I said, he tells me, "This is so-and-so from the FBI. Would you come down on your own without being sent a subpoena?"
I get a phone call. "Paul, yes, we'd like you to come down to the federal building to tell us about your time you spent in Marseille." I said, "Who is this?" "It's the FBI."
I went downtown to New York, the FBI headquarters. They started questioning me. Question was, what kind of Jews were they? Communists? And I looked at them and I said, "What do you mean communists?"
And one guy says, "You get against our country. You're working with the communists." I says, "I don't know what you're talking about."
They asked me if I knew the names, some Russian names. I did not know them. They asked me if I'd had any training in sabotage or that kind of thing. Of course, I had not.
While Paul and Harold were released, Murray had to appear in court charged with serving in an illegal foreign service.
And we go to court, and the judge asked me a few questions. So my lawyer says, all he did was go there to help survivors of the Holocaust to be free. The judge says, "You know, what do you want to plead?" So my lawyer says, "Nolo contendere," which means I throw myself on the court's mercy. The judge says, "Go back home, enjoy life, and build the country."
On May the 13th, 1948, the British finally left Palestine. A day later, Israel declared its independence. Lieutenant Alan Tyler remembers the Navy's departure.
As it drew towards midnight, we moved towards the 3-mile limit. His flag was illuminated on the mast of the ship, and they played "God Save the King." The flag came down, and that was the end of the mandate.
The things I wanted to put across to you were the sadness felt by us, the officers and the ratings, that they were having to do this disagreeable job with these women and younger people, looking on us as enemies, whereas of course we were really friends. There was the enmity of these poor people who were being shipped in appalling conditions. And right at the last minute before they were going to reach the promised land, we were stopping them from getting there.
While Murray, Paul and Duke got on with their lives, Harold reapplied for Harvard Law School. But many of the faculty opposed his readmission, They saw Harold as breaking British law and having violated Harvard standards.
And apparently a number of people had written to Harvard saying that I should not be readmitted to the Harvard Law School, that I was not suitable for Harvard, one thing or another.
Harold then wrote a letter to the dean.
And I said to the dean that I behaved in accordance with the standards, not for money purposes, but for reasons of moral motivation. I was readmitted to the second year, and one of the professors said to them, if you would exclude this man, if you will exclude this man, you would have excluded anybody who fought in the American Revolution.
Over the years, 70,000 DPs headed for Palestine by sea. The 10 American ships involved were crewed by over 200 volunteers and brought in 30,000 immigrants. The Cyprus detention camps were finally closed in the summer of 1948.